Hello and welcome to Coach Ben's mini-series on the Old Testament. This video is part 2 of the Big 5 themes of Jewish history, and I'm going to be giving some examples. So as you go, you should probably be taking notes on the Big 5 themes in accordance to the people we talk about. It may help you in the future. But before we get started, the Old Testament is ultimately a dramatic story. It has all kinds of stories in it. You've already started seeing them: murder, love, hate, comedy at parts. It's just anything you can think of, and it's all kinds of random stories. We are not going to go through every story, that would take way too long. Instead, let's focus on some of those first Genesis stories that you are very familiar with, because that will help you understand. We'll start with, of course, the easiest of all, Adam and Eve. Now, before we start, let's get a reminder of the 5 themes: covenant, land, exile, Messiah. And I missed one: covenant, land, temple, exile, and Messiah. So the covenant, we've said so many times with Adam and Eve, they can live in the Garden of Eden. They can live in paradise as long as they don't eat that forbidden fruit. So that's the covenant. Land, pretty simple: the Garden of Eden, the paradise. Temple is a little more challenging sometimes for Adam and Eve. I talked about it last video. In this case, it could be several different things. It could be their bodies, because once they sinned, they covered up their bodies, so their bodies can be seen as temples. Otherwise, it could be the tree in which they are not supposed to eat. That could be the temple. Some people would even argue that paradise, the land itself, is a temple. Exile. Well, once they've sinned, they were banished. So, bang, boom, gone, off the land. And then the Messiah. In this case, Messiah is very, very tricky, because there is no other people that come around, and Adam doesn't really do anything to become the Messiah. Neither does Eve. So in this case, God actually is still very present in the Bible. So God, it comes down and then finds favor with them and gives them a child. And then there's another covenant that starts with Eve and Adam, but we're not going to talk about that one. Cain and Abel, another challenging one, because it's a very short story, doesn't have very much connection. The covenant is not really there with with Cain and Abel. So we actually have to look at that covenant with Adam and Eve about having offspring. And then we can look at land. Land is very simple. They are kicked off the land already because of the original sin. Temple, well, they both give offerings to God. So in their offerings, they're building a shrine, and then that shrine becomes the temple. Exile, Cain is banished after he kills his brother. And then Messiah, once again, challenging situation. Who's the Messiah? Who's the Savior? Well, once again, God's still in favor with them and grants them another son to continue the lineage. So you don't always have to make the connection to a particular person, but maybe more into a particular story. In the story of Noah and the ark, God makes a covenant with Noah, which is, you build this huge, massive, beautiful ark, gather up the animals, and you will be saved. Not only will you be saved, you will be given land. So the land becomes very clear with the concept of land. He gets land once he floods the earth. The temple is the ark itself. It becomes their safe voyage. It becomes their place of worship. It becomes their connection to God. Exile, well, the land is being flooded, so they're off the land for 40 days and 40 nights. And then Messiah figure, once again, God, because he will save them. Or you can even look at, in a more abstract kind of view, the dove that gets sent out and finds land. That could be seen as God working through the dove. Other stories will have an actual Messiah come through. Abraham and Isaac, once again, we're looking at a story between them. And this picture kind of shows it all. Covenant, Abraham's asked to make a sacrifice, and he does it. He shows his loyalty by following through until the last second, where the angel stops him, which is the Messiah type figure, which comes from God. And then exile is that they weren't on their land, he's going to get land, which is also a connection to land, where this is where God actually promises him the land. And the temple is the altar that is built for Isaac's sacrifice. There's also other covenants in this story too. If you read the Bible, the chapters say covenant with Abram, and then there's another one, a covenant with Abram. So there's more than one covenant and more than one connection in some of these stories. Moses, covenant with God, of course, very simple. God talks to Moses and says, hey, I need you to save my people. And Moses does what he says, and gets part of that covenant is he gets the staff of power. Land is the people are not on their land. They're in Egypt, and there's another part of it is they're in the desert. So there's land, and they're trying to get to the promised land. So there's a lot of concept of land here. Temple, well, we see the Ten Commandments show up because they're in the desert. People are worshiping false gods and icons, and so we get the Ten Commandments, which becomes very important to everyone. Exile, well, they were in slavery and they're in the desert. And then Messiah, well, you have the Messiah as Moses is actually being the Messiah in this story because he is saving the people. And then Joshua comes along to the second half of that and can also be seen as, even though he's a judge, he's a Messiah-like figure. So those are some examples. Oh, here a little cartoon, crossing the Red Sea, turn right at Mount Sinai, reach the destination, promised land, arrival time, 40 years, part of exile, right? And there you go, just being a little funny there. Ten Commandments as the temple. The Ark of the Covenant is where the Ten Commandments get placed into. So this can also be seen as the temple. It's just a shrine to host the Ten Commandments. And this is actually God's manifestation. We don't see God ever in a human form or even in anything from, we don't get anything from God to hold on to except for maybe Jesus, if you want to make that connection. But besides that, we don't have anything from God. So here's the Ten Commandments, and they cherish it in that. Temple, in Solomon's case, Solomon builds a temple, so temple can be very clear here. It's a worshiping place for God. And so those are just some examples of stories that we get when we look at some of the people in Genesis.